First one is chapter 10. What?
2 Timothy.
Oh.
So it is.
Right.
Yep. Yep. Darn bifocals. Okay, 2 Timothy, which I have marked. I just got to find.
There we go.
Alrighty. 2 Timothy, 2nd chapter, 23rd and 24th verse. Have nothing to do with foolish and ignorant speculations. You know they breed quarrels, and the servant of the Lord must not be quarrelsome, but kindly towards all. And from John, if I can find it. The 13th chapter of John, the 35th verse. If there is this love among you, then all will know you are my disciples. And from Romans, the 12th chapter, the 18th verse. If possible, so far as it lies with you, live at peace with all men and women.
So the first thing I decided that I would read and we could discuss is an article that is from the Anabaptist World magazine. And I am probably not going to pronounce some of these things right because it is written by a person who grew up in Indonesia. But I will give it a try. Hindi, I'll just leave it at that, Hindi, wrote this article, to live peaceably with all, try some silaturahmi.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yes. You're the expert.
Yeah, sounded good to me. Okay. When was the last time you gathered with others simply to enjoy their company? It's a rare and special experience, a bit like a Thanksgiving meal in the United States, but we don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Indonesia. Instead, we have a word for these gatherings, silaturahmi, which means strengthening the bonds of friendship. The beauty of silaturahmi is that it's not scheduled on the calendar. It can happen at any time, centered on connecting with one another. For Christians in Indonesia, silaturahmi holds unique significance. As a religious minority in a predominantly Muslim society, we value the importance of maintaining peace and harmony with neighbors who have different beliefs. The term silaturahmi is not exclusive to Christians. It's Arabic and commonly used by our Muslim neighbors. It underscores that the desire for connection, understanding, and peaceful coexistence transcends religious boundaries. What makes it so special is the respect it fosters. During these gatherings, we share stories about our families, experiences, and life in general. We steer clear of politics and other controversial subjects. There are appropriate times to talk about disagreements, but to experience silaturahmi, we keep our disputes private. This aligns with the wisdom found in 2 Timothy 2:23, which advises us to have nothing to do with stupid and senseless controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. Silaturahmi focuses on what unites us, to strengthen relationships through understanding and empathy. Silaturahmi prevents polarization and division. It equips us to seek justice, find common ground, and foster harmony. The key to achieving this lies in prioritizing love, which transcends boundaries. With love at the forefront, we can build trust, bridging gaps that might have kept us apart. Jesus' words in John 13:35, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another," highlight the transformative power of love in fostering unity and understanding among people. Back in 2015, the internet buzzed with a heated debate regarding the color of a dress. I don't know if you remember that. I do. Was it white and gold, or black and blue? Due to slight adjustments in contrast and brightness, an optical illusion emerged, dividing people into two camps with differing color perceptions. The debate about the colors of the dress reminded us that even something as seemingly straightforward as color can be interpreted in contrasting ways. The more Salata Harami we cultivate with each other, the more we realize our perceptions may not align. Strengthening our friendship allows us to develop the relationships needed to coexist peacefully. It helps us to do as Romans 12:18 says, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." What is more important, to be right or to have peace? In my Indonesian culture, we don't often express our disagreements openly. We avoid conflicts, hoping they will resolve themselves over time. This may differ from the Western perspective, where identifying and addressing the problem is seen as essential to solving it. Which approach is more effective? I believe that to answer this question, we must truly know the people with whom we disagree. We need to understand them, their hopes, fears, and pains, and what brings them joy. What better way to achieve this than through Salata Harami? Our ability to come together, embrace differences, and foster connections is a powerful force for good. When we practice Salata Harami, we transcend divisions and find common ground, even in a world where perceptions may differ, just as the colors of a dress in a photograph may vary in the eyes of different beholders. The more we engage in these meaningful gatherings, the brighter our shared future becomes.
Okay, now it's time for the Matthew passage. The first one is from the 10th chapter, the 14th verse. "If anyone will not receive you or listen to what you say, then as you leave that house or that town, shake the dust of it off your feet." And the second one is from the 25th chapter, verses 37 through 40. "Then the righteous will reply, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and fed you, or thirsty and gave you a drink, a stranger and took you home, or naked and clothed you? When did we see you ill or in prison and come to visit you?' And the king will answer, 'I tell you this, anything you did for one of my brothers here, however humble, you did for me.'"
So the second reading is from this book. How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. And the author, Melissa Flora Bixler, is a Mennonite pastor, I believe. Yeah, Raleigh Mennonite Church is where she's a pastor. And so for a Mennonite to be writing about how to have an enemy, that's kind of intriguing. And so I thought I'd read a little bit about what she writes. I'm not going to read a whole chapter, don't worry. But she's been talking about Paul and the church. So Paul is not always successful at convincing the church to change its economic and social structure for the good of the most vulnerable among them. At times, powerful people overtake the community of the church and refuse to undergo the change in socioeconomic status, cultural identity, or solidarity required for a diverse people to be one. When this happens, when a faction or a false teacher sways the congregation towards disunity and dissension, Paul does not demand unity at all costs. There are times when we can no longer hold together because the cost is too great. Over the past decades, in response to the damage and pain of fundamentalism, I've watched churches turn a new page of tolerance and inclusion. Many may disagree, I hear in these churches, but we can worship together. We can establish relationships first. This will propel us toward one another, allowing us to overcome even the most profound and painful divisions between us. We can see the image of God in one another. Often in these churches, we hear that the focus should be on Jesus rather than on those things that divide us: race, gender, sexuality, or socioeconomic status. But this veneer is thin, and it only requires slight pressure to reveal how little force this kind of inclusiveness can withstand. Those who bear the cost of that eventual tearing are people who occupy the margins of social and economic power, the people whose lives are not celebrated but tolerated in the church. They are the disruptors of the peaceful status quo of enemy-free church spaces. I've heard stories about this feigned peace in churches that refuse to offer a clear statement regarding their stance on LGBTQ people. Despite a clear anti-gay theological position known and taught by church leaders, this knowledge is kept secret from the people in the pews. The decision to keep this information hidden can be a source of damage and trauma to LGBTQ people. It's not unusual for LGBTQ people to make the discovery about the church's orientation toward them only after forming deep bonds or being rejected from leadership position when they come out. Churches err when inclusion and tolerance mask conflict as a way to avoid the costly work of anti-oppression. Dante Stewart was in his truck when he heard the news report about Arlton Sterling, a black man shot and killed at close range by police in Baton Rouge during an attempted arrest. Sitting there, Stewart took time to compose himself. Dante, a black man, was about to lead an anti-racism training for a predominantly white church, a church he knew was more interested in forgiveness than righteous anger. Looking back over the years he spent in evangelicalism, attempting to shift white churches away from apathy and toward racial justice, Stewart says bluntly, the project failed. They wanted change, he writes, but not the type of change that meant being re-educated out of their racial ignorance. Often these congregations wanted cosmetic changes, such as the cultivation of a multiracial worship service, all without discussing the structural anti-blackness and white supremacy within their leadership and culture. These conversations would lead to minimal action. Someone would say we would be okay, and then segue into saying something that would move our churches and society into racial reconciliation. Rarely did Stewart see movement that addressed core issues. Jesus draws a line and places himself on one side of it. He asks us to stand there with him. We leave behind our old lives to join him there. This means that the good news will disrupt our jobs and the way we spend money, our conceptions of racial hierarchies and church leadership, and our assumptions about policing and prisons. And these changes are not always received as good news. Reworking life toward the gospel is often labeled as disruptive and divisive by those who benefit from a social order constructed by coercive power. Our churches are not neutral enclaves of equality. Like the church in Corinth, we replace society's economic, social, gendered, and racial hierarchies in our congregations. We replicate. We create structures where certain groups of people make decisions and control the money. Our boards, vestries, and denominations determine who has power. We are embedded in traditions that exacerbate inequality and cut off opportunities for discernment because we fear conflict and its accompanying loss of members and revenue. As Dante Stewart experienced, it is often people at the margins of power who bear the weight of changing the culture of power in the local church. It is not unusual for people at the center of power to charge those with marginal access to power with the task of fixing their own marginalization. It is a problem when those who are the strongest advocates for tolerance are those who do not bear the weight of that tolerance. Pay attention to who is asking for unity, bracketing off part of people's lives as if our sexual identity, gender, or race were a secondary consideration is only possible for people whose identity is considered normative, whole, and good in the hierarchy of social power. This kind of unity is only possible for those who have little on the line, those whose bodies are considered tolerable. This way of organizing church life is a manifestation of the old order that Jesus comes to abolish. Inclusion may be a way to avoid difficult conversations that could change our churches to their very core. These difficult conversations could cause people to leave the church. When our congregations avoid transformative conflict because of fears of alienating people empowered by money and influence, we are in breach of the good news. Tolerance of intolerable difference is a cost borne by those dispossessed of power. I've watched queer people struggle for recognition in anti-gay churches, women who spend their lives attempting to carve out priestly spaces in the Catholic Church, and Black leaders burn out within the intractable white supremacy of evangelicalism. Some people are called to this work. They cultivate communities and practices that sustain them for the long work of shifting a culture, but others are broken by it. They continue on because they are told that church is not a place for their nourishment, nor a space to hold their anger and pain, but a place to sacrifice themselves. They are present to offer the gift of diversity to people intertwined with their oppression. The terrible death-dealing lie is that their self-destruction is required to love their enemies. I am certain that if Jesus' news will be good, it will be good for those who have been merely tolerated in the church rather than brought to the center as its priests. And that good news comes to us through the word Jesus spoke to his disciples as they prepare to go out as witnesses to proclaim the good news. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gathers 72 of his disciples. I can imagine the shock on their faces when, instead of receiving a packing list, Jesus instructs them to go to Judea empty-handed. The disciples will be vulnerable to the hospitality of the community they enter, and it is there that they will pronounce peace. It is not the peace of the Pax Romana, a peace that thrives on the suppression of discord, sedition, and war by the sword. Instead, the peace Jesus offers is communal good, wholeness, and social reordering where the first become the last and the last become first. This is a peace that can be offered and can be taken away. The disciples are to come to a town and welcome the reception of whoever will take them in. But Jesus tells them something else. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Jesus alludes to a practice of dusting off the feet to symbolically shake off the dirt from Gentile lands that gathers on the sandals. It is a rejection of self-purification. In this metaphor, those who refuse the good news are comparable to the archetypal pagan nations of the Hebrew Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. In his pronouncement to leave behind even religious kin who will not receive the good news, Jesus shifts the disciples' allegiances. As he says throughout his teachings, the natural bond of lineage, tradition, and practice do not constitute the kind of solidarity that interests Jesus. In his reconfigured age of good news, we discover our enemies are just as likely those with whom we share the most in common, our communities, churches, and families. When I see hopeful changemakers broken by powerful cultures of white supremacy, homophobia, and sexism, I remember the words of Samuel Wells. This isn't failure, it's rejection. Jesus doesn't want us broken apart and martyred for people who refuse the good news of our lives. We are given permission to leave, holding on to power, ignoring the words of prophets, refusing to hear those who have news of liberation. These are their own judgments. We have no need to give ours. In the end, ordering life by the rules of coercive power opens the door to destruction and death. This good news will not come from the wealthy or the politically and socially connected. It will not come from those obsessed with their own righteousness through piety or religious practice. It will not come from those who lay heavy burdens on people's backs or who ignore the cries of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. To follow Jesus into the life of the beatified community requires discernment between difference and enmity. This discernment is a form of life that shifts and changes and loops back on itself, where we must fail and repent and try again. As we go about the work, we claim our place in a new order of forgiveness and grace that wears down the deep patterns of violence we each hold in our bodies. We cannot commit to this life if we are unwilling to let go of those who are against God's renewed order. Jesus will come among those pushed aside and pushed down, those marked as others, those deemed suspicious because of who they love or how they live. One of the most sobering passages in Matthew comes from a long teaching about future judgment. Jesus tells the listeners that a time will come when peoples are divided like sheep and goats. One group will be blessed, one cast out. But the criteria for this decision are notably absent of beliefs or doctrines. No confession of faith, no baptism, no heresy mark the difference between those who are judged in this apocalyptic story. Instead, God welcomes those who saw Jesus in the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. And it is the righteous, those welcomed into the kingdom, who are left puzzled. They ask, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? Even as they did these things, they did not know that they had cared for God. They attended to the places of suffering they saw around them, and there God was present. From this passage, we learn that there is enough evidence in the suffering of the world for people to encounter and love Jesus. We should not need miraculous visitations or stirring teachings. There is enough suffering in the world that people do not need to be convinced to align their lives with those who are victims of the old order of power. We don't get this right every time, and the way toward unity around the crucified and risen Jesus is often marked with failure and repentance. This is where Jesus draws the line, where he invites us to set up our lives and welcome others to the liberatory and disruptive good news of upended social convention. This is where a new people is made from those who were hungry and thirsty, who waste away in prisons, and who linger in sick wards. Jesus cares about what we do with our lives. If there are people who will not join this work, who harm the witness of this good news, we shake off the dust and return to the work given us to do.